One of the many goals of the Verve, from a world-building perspective, is to be a unique take on magic, which leads to new kinds of stories, solutions, and creativity. That being said, having some familiar elements significantly helps people to find their footing in the setting. Not to mention, as the designer, I am inspired by these archetypal fantasy ideas, and how I can twist or reframe them in a Vervic lens. It's just cool. As a science fantasy magic system, the Verve has many limitations, which means some of these traditional fantasy elements just don't work. In some cases, I think this is a good and interesting thing, such as, I like how there's no way to use the Verve to teleport or to polymorph. I think that's cool. In other cases, these limits are something I like to push against, and see what I can and can't justify in the setting. I did this fairly recently when I asked, what would Vervic dragons look like? The fun of pushing against the edges of the magic system rules led to, I think, a really cool design. So in this video I want to do it again. Stretch the system a little by asking, what could Vervic curses and diseases look like? First, why am I grouping curses and magical diseases together? In a word, longevity. Both are types of magical conditions with an extended duration. Curses aren't like a wound, they hang over you like a shroud. They're a blight on your soul. To be cursed or hexed is not to be simply debuffed or weakened, it is to be branded, possibly for life. At least, that's what I think is most meaningful about traditional manifestations of curses. Diseases, similarly, are notable for their duration of effect, perhaps weeks, years, or a lifetime. The key difference, of course, is that curses are typically bestowed by some malevolent act, where diseases are natural. But even then, these distinctions are blurry. You just have to look to history for that. Another key difference is that diseases are typically transmissible from one person to another. Curses, on the other hand, tend to stay put on their original target. The one exception in popular myth is cursed objects, which certainly do transmit their curse to the holder or wearer. Similarly, not all diseases are transmissible, another blurry distinction. Magical diseases go a step beyond regular diseases, either affecting something magical or spiritual. I think the archetypal example being the disease of undeath or zombification. Alternatively, the magic can be the cause or mechanism of the disease. It might affect you in mundane ways, nausea, pain, blindness, etc. But if a physician assesses you, they would find no biological cause. This makes them particularly tricky to cure. What I'm getting at is there are lots of options for the ways in which these similar ideas of curses and magical diseases can manifest in fantasy stories. And that's why I think this is a good question to ask, because I think it would be cool to be able to tell these types of stories in my setting, but with a unique science fantasy twist. Stories of witches in the forest cursing children, or of dangerous objects which doom whoever holds them. Stories of terrible creatures whose bite is something worse than just a wound. Or a plague sweeping through a town and no one can explain it. In a world where basically everyone has a little magical ability, how would a pandemic that disables magic affect society? These are all great hooks, and so I'm curious to see what they look like in the Verve. After some thinking, I've come up with 3 ideas for curses or diseases in the Verve. And a video in the near future, hopefully, will be about a 4th, as undeath is a whole separate discussion topic, I think. As always, this video will assume you have some knowledge of how the magic system works. But don't worry if you don't, a helpful playlist is linked in the top corner. So, here we go. Vervic diseases and curses. In my opinion, I've saved the best for last, but I hope you find them all interesting. Pivots are an essential component of magical ability. The fundamental particle, which exists in almost all atoms, is the only to interact with the Verve. As living creatures lose cells, these cells will need to be replaced. Built from proteins, fats, and other chemicals, these new cells will, if one's food did, contain new pivots to replace the ones lost. However, the presence of pivots is not guaranteed. Some plants and animals are fundamentally pivotless, or may, for environmental or other factors, have a reduced pivot density. Eating these foods will lead to a pivot deficiency in the consumer, and pivot deficiency could go on to affect whole ecosystems if a primary food source is impacted. Pivot deficiency is, as nutrient deficiencies go, fairly minor. Its main effect is temporary loss or reduction in one's magical abilities, their spells being of lower potency, and their reduced pivot density making them more vulnerable to spells themselves. However, the loss of pivots can impact balance, proprioception, that is the awareness of your body and limb positioning, and in extreme cases lead to shakes and jitters, a feeling of weightlessness, nausea, and a painful pins and needles-like sensation in the skin. These effects are mostly from the lack of sensation and forces normally experienced. Your body is so used to interaction with the verve that the loss of it, or the reduction, is disorienting. Body parts which replace their cells more frequently are naturally affected more, so the skin and stomach linings are first to go, whereas heart and brain cells are mostly unaffected. Pivot deficiency is felt most extremely by those who might dope with pivots, increasing their natural pivot density by consuming foods engineered or curated to be pivot dense, or through drugs or supplements. Such people are typically wealthy, or members of the ruling elite with the resources to be so picky. Doping is used to achieve higher spell amplitude and resistance, so is naturally done to some elite units of warriors or mages, where militaries have the ability to do so. Naturally, there is also a subset of the criminal world who might traffic in these valuable, highly pivoted foods. Some might even mix inedible pivoted materials like crystals or ores into foods to try and increase pivot intake. Pivot doping is not without risks. Many similar symptoms as deficiency can occur if one is not trained to deal with the change, often inducing nausea, jitters, and pain, but mainly fatigue and weakness from the extra energy exerted to move so many pivots through the verve. And when doping ends, they are likely to go through withdrawal symptoms, very similar to pivot deficiency, but with often more severe effects. Pivots are unique not only in their sole interaction with the verve, but also in their interaction with electromagnetic waves. The vibration, spin, and charge of a pivot vary based on the field forces they experience, and vice versa. Their field interactions are affected by spin and charge. This is the mechanism for electrical and psychic or photonic spellcasting, but also makes the exact behavior of pivots very tricky to study. When pivots are struck with a particular electropotential or equivalent vervic wave, they can sometimes get into a strange state known as rigidity. Rigid pivots, as implied by the contradiction, get stuck in a true neutral state, such that they no longer interact with electromagnetic fields, or, quite bizarrely, the verve too, effectively becoming dead, as if there was no pivot there at all. Rigidity is a very rare effect, almost impossible to replicate, but is most associated with being struck by lightning, or being hit by a particularly powerful vervic wave, such as from the shattering. However, there are rumours that some very powerful and dangerous spellcasters are able to inflict the curse of rigidity upon you. Rigidity rarely affects someone completely. Indeed, from an electrical shock, the effect is typically localized to the path the discharge took to ground. Similar to coronographic markings, branching root-like patterns across the skin or muscles, which lose their vervic abilities, are visible. It is said that those who inflict rigidity upon you can mark that moment into these patterns as a record of what was done to you. Rigidity is very slow to recover from, particularly if the effect ran deep into bone or vital organs. But then again, if you manage to survive such a discharge, you should probably count yourself lucky, and the loss of spellcasting, if sufficiently localized, can be worked around with retraining and time. The final type of magical affliction in this video is a much broader category, and therefore has many names. Ringing, the soul shakes, or for the more scientifically minded, esocymatics. But most simply call it the tremor, sometimes an essential tremor, as it is a tremor in one's essence. The cause and effects of a tremor are hugely varied, but the mechanism is the same. A tremor is a subtle and highly stable vibrational mode. If a pivot finds itself vibrating with a particular pattern of these kinds, they become rhythmically stuck, and any new perturbations being eventually drowned out, and the pivot returns to this same hypnotic mode. What's particularly insidious about this kind of affliction is that it spreads. As one pivot starts to vibrate in this strange way, others nearby begin to be influenced similarly, and soon all the pivots in an object or a living creature get in sync. If in proximity for long enough, the tremor can spread from one to another, or between proximate objects. This is similar to how a table of metronomes will eventually influence each other and align. Or perhaps in living creatures a more apt comparison would be cancer, an unnatural cell mutation which begins to spread and replicate uncontrollably throughout the body. Initially, the effects are minor. Creatures affected might feel unsteady, tingly, or paranoid. However, as the infection spreads, the particular tuning of the tremor starts to produce a significant effect, associated with whatever frequency composition it holds. High-frequency tremors can cause intense pain, muscle spasms, and other forms of loss of motor control, sensory disruption, hallucinations, and even personality changes. Medium frequency can cause a burning or freezing pain, a fever, reduce muscle function, and affect sleep. Low-frequency tremors can lead to issues in blood flow and pressure, nausea, loss of balance, and swelling or even disfigurement. Much like how spells can have specific effects encoded into modulations of the waveform, the precise effect of a tremor is determined by the combination of primary and subfrequencies present. This also affects its rate and range of spreading. Curing a tremor, or dispelling it from an object, is a difficult and poorly understood topic. Those who even know enough to diagnose the issue may suggest anything from hot water and ice water baths, Vervic bombardment, to eating particular foods or potions. Many, particularly those of faith, believe that travelling to a core frequency hotspot, or being hit by the shattering, is the only true way to banish the tremor for good. Tremors do eventually die down, but the vibrational mode is so stable this typically takes months to years. And any movement or Vervic stimulation can increase this timeline by unintentionally re-energizing the system. The cause of tremors is similarly unknown, but they often occur where intense Vervic waves have taken place, such as in magic warfare, arcane experiments, the shattering, or near Vervic hotspots. As with rigidity, some believe that terrifying mages have mastered crafting tremors and use them to curse people and objects, marking them as their own, or for punishment. If you enjoy this kind of world-building content, remember to hit like and subscribe, as there's plenty more to come. Thanks for watching.